The German soldiers in Pillbox Seven-Two heard it before they saw it, a low mechanical hiss, different from the sound of tank engines or artillery. Then came the liquid roar, and suddenly the firing slit that had protected them moments before became a portal for something far worse than bullets. Pressurized flame jetted through the narrow opening with the force of a fire hose, filling the concrete chamber in seconds. The men inside had trained for artillery bombardment, for direct tank fire, for infantry assault with grenades and satchel charges. They had never trained for this. The bunker crew abandoned their position in absolute panic, stumbling out through the rear entrance into American rifle fire, choosing bullets over burning. This was near Saint-Lô, France, on the afternoon of July 26, 1944, and it was neither the first nor the last time German troops would make that choice. The weapon that caused this instant collapse of defensive discipline was the Fortification M2 flamethrower, a mechanical system that weighed 68 pounds when fully loaded and could project burning fuel 40 to 45 yards in sustained bursts lasting 7 to 9 seconds. American soldiers called it various names, some official, most not. To the German troops who faced it, the weapon had only one designation that appeared consistently in tactical reports and prisoner interrogations: Terrorwaffe, terror weapon. Not a weapon that inspired terror as psychological effect, but a weapon that caused immediate, uncontrollable panic that overrode training, discipline, and survival instinct. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The designation was not propaganda or exaggeration. It was clinical assessment. German after-action reports from France in the summer of 1944 documented something military planners had not anticipated. Trained. Infantry abandoning prepared defensive positions at the first sign of flamethrower deployment, often before the weapon was even fired. Officers reported losing control of entire bunker complexes, not through destruction, but through desertion, as crews fled positions that were structurally intact and fully supplied. The psychological break was complete and instantaneous. Concrete that could withstand 75mm tank shells offered no protection against pressurized flame that sought every opening, every ventilation gap, every firing port designed to give defenders a tactical advantage. The irony was profound and would have seemed almost theatrical if the consequences had not been so immediate and deadly. The German military had spent 5 years perfecting the art of fortification. The West Wall, built before the war began, represented the most sophisticated defensive engineering of its era. The Atlantic Wall, constructed during occupation, incorporated lessons learned from combat across Europe. Both systems relied on the fundamental principle that concrete and steel could create survivable fighting positions where soldiers could engage attackers from protected locations. The bunker was supposed to be the solution to modern firepower, the answer to tanks and artillery and aerial bombardment. It was supposed to keep men alive while they did their work. The M2 flamethrower revealed a flaw so fundamental that it called into question the entire defensive doctrine. Any opening large enough to fire a weapon through was large enough for pressurized flame to enter, and once flame entered a sealed concrete space, there was no escape. The German confidence in bunker warfare was not misplaced romanticism or propaganda delusion. It was based on carefully studied engineering principles and combat experience from the First World War. The massive concrete fortifications of Verdun had withstood artillery bombardments that turned entire landscapes into moonscapes. Fort Douaumont, built by the French but captured by Germans in 1916, had survived direct hits from the largest guns in the French arsenal. Its concrete walls, in some places over 8 feet thick, had proven that properly designed fortifications could protect men even under the most intense firearm that industrial warfare could produce. The lesson was clear. Thickness of concrete multiplied by quality of reinforcement equaled survivability. By 1936, when construction began on the West Wall, German military engineers had refined these principles into comprehensive fortification doctrine. The West Wall, known to the Allies as the Siegfried Line, eventually comprised over 18,000 bunkers, tunnels, and tank traps stretching nearly 400 miles along Germany's western frontier. The bunkers varied in size and purpose, from small machine gun posts housing 4 men to large artillery casemates with crews of 20 or more. But they all shared certain design features that reflected hard lessons from previous wars. Walls were typically 1 to 3 meters thick, poured with reinforced concrete mixing Portland cement with aggregate stone. Steel reinforcement bars, often scavenged from civilian construction projects as resources became scarce, were embedded throughout to prevent catastrophic failure under bombardment. Firing ports were designed with specific geometric considerations: wide enough inside for weapons traverse, narrow on the exterior to minimize target profile for enemy fire. The ventilation systems incorporated baffles and turns to prevent projectiles from entering while allowing air circulation. Multiple entrance points provided redundancy if one route was blocked by rubble. Interior spaces were compartmentalized, with thick walls between rooms to contain damage if explosive rounds penetrated. Each design element addressed a specific threat observed in previous combat. The result was structures that German military planning documents confidently stated could withstand anything except prolonged, concentrated bombardment by the heaviest artillery, and even then would require extensive fire to destroy rather than simply damage. The Atlantic Wall, constructed beginning in 1942, incorporated these same principles with modifications for coastal defense. Beach-facing bunkers housed anti-tank guns, machine guns, and artillery positions oriented to create interlocking fields of fire across landing zones. The designers studied Normandy's geography with meticulous attention, identifying likely invasion beaches and positioning fortifications to maximize defensive capability. By June 1944, the Atlantic Wall included over 8,000 coastal fortifications in France alone, with many more scattered across occupied territories from Norway to Spain. The concrete consumed by this construction program was staggering, over 17 million cubic yards, requiring resources that might otherwise have gone to other military purposes. But the investment seemed justified by sound military logic. Infantry fighting from protected positions could engage far larger attacking forces with relative safety. Artillery operating from fortified casemates could continue firing even under counter-battery bombardment. The bunker allowed smaller defensive forces to hold positions against numerically superior attackers, a critical advantage for Germany, as manpower shortages became more severe after 1943. German soldiers training for defensive operations learned bunker doctrine as fundamental tactical knowledge. Training emphasized fields of fire, ammunition management, communication between positions, and procedures for weathering artillery bombardment. Crews practiced remaining in position during simulated artillery fire, learning to trust their concrete shelter. Medical training covered treatment of concussion injuries and the psychological management of men under sustained bombardment. Officers studied examples from the Eastern Front where bunker complexes had held against Soviet attacks, sometimes for weeks, inflicting disproportionate casualties while preserving their own forces. The bunker was not just fortification. It was comprehensive defensive system backed by training, doctrine, and battlefield experience that validated its effectiveness. The M2 flamethrower that American infantry carried into France in June 1944 was a refined evolution of earlier designs, incorporating lessons learned from combat in the Pacific Theater, where flamethrowers had proven effective against Japanese bunkers and cave positions. The weapon consisted of 3 main components: 2 fuel cylinders, a smaller compressed gas cylinder, and the gun assembly with ignition system. The entire unit weighed approximately 43 pounds empty and 68 pounds when fully loaded with fuel. This was not light equipment. A soldier carrying an M2 flamethrower was burdened with weight equivalent to a full infantry pack, and the distinctive silhouette of the cylinders on his back made him a priority target for enemy marksmen who quickly learned to recognize flamethrower operators. The fuel cylinders held 4 gallons of flamethrower fuel, a mixture that evolved throughout the war. Early formulations used gasoline thickened with rubber dissolved into the liquid, creating a gel that would stick to surfaces and continue burning. By 1944, American chemical engineers had developed napalm, a more effective thickening agent created by mixing naphthalene and palmitate with gasoline. The resulting gel had superior adhesion properties and burned at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. More importantly, for tactical purposes, napalm maintained consistency across a wider temperature range than earlier formulations, meaning the weapon functioned reliably, whether in the heat of a French summer or the cold of a Belgian winter. The compressed gas cylinder, positioned between the two fuel tanks, held nitrogen or carbon dioxide pressurized to approximately 360 pounds per square inch. This pressure was the key to the weapon's effectiveness. When the operator opened the valve and pulled the trigger on the gun assembly, pressurized gas forced fuel through the wand at tremendous velocity. The fuel stream traveled 40 to 45 yards in a tight, coherent jet before breaking up into droplets. This was not a diffuse spray, but a directed stream of burning liquid with enough force to penetrate narrow openings and enough coherence to maintain its trajectory over combat distances. The ignition system used magnesium cartridges that created a spark at the gun's nozzle, igniting the fuel as it emerged. Earlier flamethrower designs had used pilot lights that burned continuously, giving away the operator's position and creating a fire hazard. The cartridge ignition system eliminated these problems, allowing operators to approach targets without revealing themselves until they fired. The effective firing time for a fully loaded M2 was 7 to 9 seconds of continuous flame projection, or approximately 10 one-second bursts if the operator fired intermittently. This seems remarkably brief, barely enough time to engage a single target, but combat reports consistently showed that 1 or 2 seconds of flame was sufficient to achieve psychological effect against fortified positions. The weapon did not need to kill the defenders to neutralize the position. It needed only to make staying inside the bunker more terrifying than facing whatever dangers waited outside. The M2's tactical employment reflected understanding of this psychological dimension. Flamethrower operators typically worked in teams with rifle infantry, providing covering fire and protection. The standard approach to a bunker involved suppressing fire from rifles and machine guns to keep defenders away from firing ports, followed by the flamethrower operator advancing to within effective range, usually 25 to 30 yards for accuracy against small openings. Training for flamethrower operators emphasized several key principles. First, approach from angles that denied the enemy clear lines of fire, using terrain and smoke for concealment. Second, aim for openings rather than attempting to burn through solid walls, recognizing the weapon's purpose was getting flame inside structures rather than destroying them externally. Third, fire in short bursts to conserve fuel and maintain pressure, since effectiveness diminished as tank pressure dropped. Fourth, immediately seek cover after firing, because the bright flame and distinctive fuel trail revealed the operator's position to every enemy soldier within visual range. The training was realistic about life expectancy. Flamethrower operators in the Pacific had suffered casualty rates significantly higher than regular infantry. German and Japanese soldiers both prioritized killing flamethrower operators before they could deploy their weapons. A man carrying visible fuel tanks on his back, approaching defensive positions, was obviously preparing to do something devastating. Enemy soldiers shot at him with focused intensity, understanding that allowing him to reach effective range meant catastrophic consequences for anyone in bunkers or fortified positions. The first widespread German encounters with American M2 flamethrowers came during the brutal hedgerow fighting in Normandy throughout July and August 1944. The bocage country south of the invasion beaches consisted of small fields separated by ancient hedgerows, dense combinations of earth banks and vegetation that had grown for centuries into natural fortifications. German defenders had reinforced these natural barriers with machine gun positions, connecting them with trenches and communication lines to create a defensive network that channeled American advances into killing zones. Every field became a small battle. Every hedgerow required separate assault. Progress was measured in hundreds of yards gained over days of fighting. American infantry tactics evolved rapidly in response to these conditions. Standard doctrine called for infantry supported by tanks, but the hedgerows limited tank mobility and created ideal conditions for German anti-tank weapons. Infantry assaults without adequate support suffered heavy casualties from interlocking machine gun fire. Commanders began employing specialized weapons more aggressively, including flamethrowers that had been present in unit inventories, but not extensively used in the initial beach landings. The Chemical Warfare Service, responsible for flamethrower development and training, had assigned specialist teams to infantry divisions, but many commanders were initially reluctant to employ what they viewed as specialized equipment requiring unique tactical considerations. The breakthrough in tactical employment came from practical necessity rather than doctrine. A company commander near Saint-Lô, facing a particularly stubborn machine gun position built into a hedgerow with overhead cover, called forward his flamethrower team in desperation after 2 platoon assaults had been repulsed with significant casualties. The operator, a private from Ohio whose name appears in after-action reports as Morrison, approached within 20 yards under covering fire and directed a 3-second burst into the position's firing aperture. The German crew emerged immediately with hands raised, abandoning their weapons and ammunition without further resistance. The position had not been destroyed. The fortification remained intact, but the men inside had experienced something that overrode their training and discipline. They chose surrender over remaining in a space where flame could reach them. Word spread quickly through both armies. American infantry officers began, requesting flamethrower support for difficult positions. The Chemical Warfare Service teams found themselves in constant demand. Soldiers who had viewed the flamethrower as specialized equipment for Pacific Island warfare recognized its effectiveness in European hedgerow fighting. The weapon's ability to neutralize fortified positions without requiring their complete destruction was particularly valuable given the slow progress and high casualty rates of conventional assaults. German intelligence began compiling reports on the new threat. Tactical bulletins warned troops about the flamethrower's appearance and capabilities, but the warnings could not adequately convey the psychological impact of facing the weapon, the primal terror of seeing flame coming toward your position with nowhere to escape. A German after-action report from the 352nd Infantry Division, dated August 3, 1944, described an engagement near Mortagne where American forces employed flamethrowers against prepared defensive positions. The report's language was notably different from standard military documentation. Instead of clinical descriptions of weapons effects and tactical outcomes, the report used terms like panic reaction and immediate position abandonment. One passage stated that defenders evacuated bunkers without orders and against orders when flamethrowers appeared, even before the weapons were fired. The report noted that officers attempting to maintain position discipline found their men unresponsive to commands, focused entirely on escaping potential fire attack. This was not cowardice in the traditional sense. These were veterans who had held positions under artillery bombardment and tank assault. But the flamethrower produced a different quality of fear, something that bypassed rational assessment and triggered instinctive flight response. The psychological mechanism was straightforward, even if its intensity was unexpected. Fire is humanity's oldest fear, coded into survival instincts at a level deeper than conscious thought. Soldiers could train themselves to function under artillery fire by understanding statistics and probability, by learning that most shells landed elsewhere, by trusting their fortifications to protect them. But fire in an enclosed space offered no statistical comfort and no protection through engineering. If flame entered your bunker, you burned. There was no calculation to make, no tactical response to consider. The only rational choice was not being there when the fire arrived. German commanders recognized this and struggled to counter it through training and discipline, but they were fighting against something more fundamental than tactical doctrine could address. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The definitive evidence of the M2 flamethrower's psychological impact came not from American reports claiming success, but from German documents attempting to understand and counteract the phenomenon. A tactical study prepared by 7th Army Headquarters in September 1944 analysed bunker abandonment rates across multiple divisions fighting in France. The study compiled data from over 200 separate engagements where American forces employed flamethrowers against fortified positions. The findings were stark and consistent. In 73% of recorded incidents, German troops evacuated their positions before flamethrowers were actually fired, responding to the presence of the weapon alone. In another 21%, evacuation occurred after 1 or 2 seconds of flame projection, before the weapon could have caused significant casualties or structural damage. Only 6% of engagements resulted in defenders maintaining their positions throughout the flamethrower attack. These numbers represented complete breakdown of defensive doctrine. The entire fortification program, the massive concrete investment, the training and preparation, all of it became irrelevant when a single soldier with an M2 flamethrower approached within effective range. The study attempted to identify factors that might improve defensive performance, better training about flamethrower limitations. Ineffective, because the fear was not based on misunderstanding, but on accurate assessment of danger. Improved bunker design with better fire suppression systems. Some positions were retrofitted with water storage and internal fire extinguishing equipment, but this proved impractical given resource constraints and the difficulty of modifying existing fortifications. Orders requiring soldiers to remain in position regardless of flamethrower presence, issued repeatedly by multiple commands and consistently ignored when actual attacks occurred. One German officer, captured near Aachen in October 1944, provided detailed testimony during interrogation about his unit's experience with American flamethrowers. He had commanded a reinforced company defending a section of the West Wall, positions he described as well constructed and properly supplied. His men were veterans, survivors of the Eastern Front, who had experienced Soviet attacks including artillery bombardments far heavier than anything the Americans had yet employed in the West. They trusted their bunkers and understood defensive tactics. When American forces approached their sector, his forward observers reported flamethrower teams among the attacking infantry. Before the Americans reached assault range, before any flame was actually fired, 2 of his bunker crews abandoned their positions and withdrew to secondary defensive lines. He ordered them back to their posts. They refused, saying they would rather face court-martial than flamethrower attack. He had no effective response to this because he understood their reasoning. When the American assault developed fully and flamethrower operators moved forward under covering fire, his remaining bunker positions evacuated in sequence as the flamethrowers came within range. Crews that had held their posts throughout preparatory artillery fire, that had engaged American infantry with disciplined machine gun fire, left their weapons and ammunition, and fled when they saw flame being directed at their positions. The officer himself, observing from a command post, saw one flamethrower operator fire a 2-second burst into a bunker firing port 30 yards away. The flame visibly entered the bunker. 3 seconds later, the entire crew emerged from the rear entrance with their hands up, surrendering immediately. The bunker was structurally undamaged. The weapons inside were still functional, but the men who had been inside chose American captivity over remaining in a space where flame could reach them. This pattern repeated across the Western Front throughout the autumn and winter of 1944. The West Wall, which German propaganda had called impregnable, which American intelligence had assessed would require months of combat to breach, proved far more vulnerable than either side had anticipated, not because the fortifications were poorly designed or constructed, but because the defenders would not stay in them when flamethrowers appeared. American forces learned to deploy flamethrowers prominently during assaults, sometimes firing them at positions well beyond effective range, simply to create visible flame and trigger defensive evacuations. The weapon's psychological effect exceeded its direct combat capability. A single flamethrower operator could neutralize multiple bunkers without necessarily destroying them or even causing casualties, simply by making the positions psychologically untenable for their defenders. German military commanders attempted multiple approaches to counter the flamethrower threat throughout the final months of 1944 and into 1945. Tactical bulletins distributed to frontline units emphasized shooting flamethrower operators before they could reach effective range, recognizing that the distinctive silhouette of fuel tanks made these soldiers identifiable targets. Snipers received specific instructions to prioritize flamethrower operators over other targets, including officers and radio operators. Some units implemented designated marksman positions, with the sole responsibility of engaging flamethrower teams during American assaults. These measures achieved limited success. American infantry tactics adapted quickly, providing heavy covering fire and smoke screens to protect flamethrower operators during their approach. The operators themselves became more cautious and skilled, using terrain and timing to minimize exposure. Other attempted solutions focused on bunker modification. Engineering directives called for reducing the size of firing ports to dimensions that might prevent flame penetration, while still allowing weapons employment. Some positions were retrofitted with internal baffles, designed to deflect flame if it entered through openings. A few fortifications received experimental fire suppression systems, essentially large water tanks with manual pumps that crews could use to flood their fighting compartments if flame entered. None of these modifications proved practical at scale. Reducing firing port size degraded the bunker's effectiveness as a fighting position by limiting fields of fire and making weapons traverse more difficult. Internal baffles consumed space in already cramped bunkers and complicated crew movement. Fire suppression systems required resources that were increasingly scarce and installation time that units engaged in active combat could not afford. Most importantly, these modifications addressed the physical threat of fire while doing nothing to counter the psychological impact. The fundamental problem remained unsolvable within the constraints of German defensive doctrine. A bunker needed openings to function as a fighting position. Those openings made it vulnerable to flamethrower attack. The only complete solution would have been bunkers with remotely operated weapons, allowing crews to fight from sealed positions without any exterior openings, technology that did not exist and could not be developed given Germany's deteriorating industrial situation. Some units attempted tactical solutions, positioning infantry outside bunkers to engage flamethrower operators before they could approach, but this defeated the purpose of fortified positions by exposing troops to conventional weapons fire. Other units experimented with aggressive counterattacks, attempting to disrupt American assaults before flamethrowers could be deployed, but this required resources and manpower that were increasingly unavailable. By early 1945, German defensive doctrine had effectively abandoned the belief that bunkers provided reliable protection against determined American assault. Training materials acknowledged flamethrower vulnerability, without offering effective countermeasures. Officers were instructed to plan for bunker evacuation as part of defensive operations, establishing secondary positions where crews could withdraw when primary fortifications became untenable. This represented complete reversal of the fortification philosophy that had dominated German defensive thinking for decades. Bunkers became temporary fighting positions rather than strongpoints to be held regardless of enemy action. The massive investment in concrete fortifications, the millions of cubic yards of material, the years of construction effort, all of it undermined by a weapon that weighed less than 70 pounds and could be carried by a single soldier. The psychological cost to German soldiers was difficult to quantify, but evident in combat performance. Troops, who had once trusted their fortifications to protect them, now understood that concrete walls offered only an illusion of security. The bunker that was supposed to keep them safe had become a trap where they could be burned alive if they remained inside. This knowledge affected morale and fighting effectiveness in ways that went beyond simple tactical considerations. Soldiers who do not trust their equipment, who understand that their defensive positions might kill them rather than protect them, cannot maintain the psychological resilience necessary for sustained defensive operations. The flamethrower had not just defeated German fortifications, it had defeated the belief system that made fortification-based defense viable. The contrast between German fortification effort and American flamethrower production illustrated the broader material disparities that characterized the war's final year. Germany had invested massive resources in constructing defensive positions across Western Europe. The Atlantic Wall alone consumed over 17 million cubic yards of concrete, required millions of man-hours of labor, and diverted construction materials from other military and civilian needs. The West Wall's construction and later reinforcement represented similar scale of investment. These were strategic-level resource allocations, decisions made at the highest levels of German military planning, based on assumptions about how defensive warfare would be conducted and what weapons would need to be countered. The M2 flamethrower, by contrast, was a relatively minor item in American military procurement. The Chemical Warfare Service produced approximately 14,000 M2 units during the war, a number that seems substantial until compared with other equipment production figures. American industry built over 40,000 Sherman tanks, over 2 million trucks, over 300,000 artillery pieces. The flamethrower was a specialized weapon produced in limited quantities because tactical doctrine did not emphasize its employment in most situations. Each unit cost approximately $200 to manufacture, an insignificant amount compared to the tens of thousands of dollars required to produce a tank or the hundreds of thousands invested in aircraft. Yet, this relatively minor weapon system, produced in limited numbers at minimal cost, effectively neutralized fortifications that had consumed resources equivalent to building hundreds of ships or thousands of aircraft. The disproportion was striking and revealed something fundamental about the relationship between defensive and offensive technologies in modern warfare. Fortifications required massive investment to construct, but could be defeated by weapons that were cheap, portable, and required minimal logistical support. A flamethrower operator carried his entire weapon system on his back. He needed no special vehicle, no dedicated supply chain, beyond standard fuel and compressed gas cylinders that were readily available, no specialized maintenance beyond basic cleaning and inspection. The weapon could be employed by regular infantry with minimal additional training. It required no supporting arms coordination, no artillery preparation, no air support. American tactical doctrine evolved to incorporate flamethrowers not as specialized assault weapons, but as standard infantry support equipment available at company and platoon level. By early 1945, most American infantry companies attacking fortified positions included at least one flamethrower team. Some units had multiple teams, recognizing the weapon's effectiveness and the relatively low cost of providing additional capability. The logistical burden was minimal. 4 gallons of fuel and a compressed gas cylinder weighed far less than equivalent amounts of explosives or ammunition that would be needed to achieve similar effects through conventional weapons. The efficiency was remarkable. One soldier with one weapon could neutralize defensive positions that might otherwise require squad or platoon-level assault with corresponding casualties. German commanders confronting this reality understood they were facing not just a tactical problem, but a fundamental strategic disadvantage. The disparity was not merely in specific weapons or particular technologies, but in the entire industrial and logistical system that could develop, produce, and deploy solutions to tactical problems faster than defenses could be adapted. The M2 flamethrower was not a wonder weapon or secret technology. It was straightforward application of existing principles, pressurized fuel projection and ignition, packaged in a portable system that infantry could employ. American chemical engineers and weapons developers had identified a vulnerability in fortified positions and created an effective counter within the normal military development process. The weapon entered production, was issued to units, and proved effective in combat. It requested more flamethrowers. Production increased to meet demand. This was industrial warfare functioning as designed, identifying problems and solving them through engineering and manufacturing capacity. The story of German troops fleeing their bunkers at the approach of M2 flamethrowers reveals something essential about the nature of defensive warfare and the psychology of fortification. The bunker was supposed to solve a fundamental problem: how to protect soldiers while allowing them to engage the enemy effectively. Concrete and steel created a space where men could fight from relative safety, where they were shielded from the majority of weapons an attacker might employ. This was not unreasonable thinking. The fortifications did provide substantial protection against conventional weapons. Artillery shells that would kill men in the open merely chipped concrete. Machine gun fire that would cut down infantry left bunker walls unmarked. Even tank rounds often failed to penetrate properly constructed positions. The engineering was sound, and the tactical logic was valid within the assumptions that guided the design. The flaw was not in the fortifications themselves, but in the fundamental impossibility of creating a fighting position that was simultaneously completely protected and fully functional. A bunker needed openings. The soldiers inside needed to see the enemy, to aim their weapons, to communicate with other positions, to breathe air that was not fouled by gunpowder smoke and human respiration. Every opening created vulnerability. Every firing port, every vision slit, every ventilation shaft was a potential entry point for attack. The German engineers who designed the bunkers understood this and attempted to minimize the vulnerability through careful design. Firing ports were angled to prevent grenades from being thrown through them. Ventilation systems had baffles to stop shrapnel. But these measures assumed attackers would employ kinetic weapons, projectiles that traveled in straight lines and could be deflected or stopped by barriers. They did not account for a weapon that could flow through narrow openings like liquid, that could seek every gap and fill enclosed spaces with sustained burning. The M2 flamethrower exploited this fundamental vulnerability, not through any particular cleverness or advanced technology, but simply by being a weapon that behaved differently than what the fortifications were designed to resist. The flame did not need to penetrate thick walls. It entered through the openings that made the bunker functional. Once inside, the concrete that was supposed to protect the crew became a trap, containing the fire and preventing escape. The Germans had built structures designed to withstand external attack, and inadvertently created chambers that concentrated and amplified the effects of weapons that could penetrate the openings. The irony was perfect and terrible. The very features that made bunkers effective, fighting positions, made them fatal when facing an attack method the designers had not anticipated. The psychological dimension was equally important, and perhaps more devastating in its implications. Soldiers could be trained to function under artillery fire by understanding that most shells landed elsewhere, that their concrete shelter would protect them from anything except direct hits, that statistical probability was in their favor. They could be trained to engage tanks by understanding weapon capabilities and armor penetration data, by trusting that their anti-tank weapons were adequate for the threat. But they could not be effectively trained to remain in an enclosed space while fire entered that space. The fear was too fundamental, too connected to basic survival instincts that existed before military training and persisted beneath it. When flame came through the firing port, all the training and discipline and tactical understanding became irrelevant. The only thought was escape, and men who had held positions under far heavier conventional bombardment fled their bunkers without orders, and often against orders. This was the cost of truth that German soldiers and commanders had to accept in the war's final months. The fortifications they had trusted were not reliable protection against determined attack using appropriate weapons. The concrete that seemed so substantial and permanent could not prevent the one attack method it was never designed to counter. The massive investment in defensive construction had been undermined by a weapon that cost a few $100s and could be carried by any infantry soldier. The lesson extended beyond the specific tactical situation. It revealed the fundamental problem of static defense in industrial warfare. Any fixed position, no matter how well constructed, eventually faces weapons specifically designed to defeat it. Defense requires constant adaptation and evolution. Once attackers identify a vulnerability and develop effective countermeasures, defensive positions become untenable, regardless of how much concrete and steel they contain. For the American soldiers who employed the M2 flamethrower, the experience was different but equally instructive. They learned that sophisticated fortifications could be defeated by relatively simple means if the weapon was properly matched to the vulnerability. They learned that psychological effects could be as important as physical destruction in neutralizing defensive positions. They learned that industrial capacity to develop and produce specialized weapons gave them enormous tactical flexibility, the ability to identify problems in combat and receive equipment solutions within the normal supply system. Most importantly, they learned that the massive German fortifications, which appeared so formidable from a distance, were vulnerable to weapons they carried themselves, that they did not need to wait for artillery or air support or specialized assault units, but could neutralize bunkers with equipment available at infantry squad level. When the war ended in May 1945, thousands of German bunkers remained structurally intact across Western Europe. The concrete had survived. The fortifications had not failed structurally, but they had failed in their essential purpose, which was keeping their defenders alive and willing to fight. The M2 Flamethrower had revealed that all the engineering and construction effort, all the millions of cubic yards of concrete, all the years of labor, could be defeated by exploiting the necessary openings that made the fortifications functional. The German troops, who had once felt secure behind thick concrete walls, had learned through bitter experience that their shelter was an illusion, that the bunker that was supposed to protect them would trap them instead if flame came through the firing ports. That knowledge, that fundamental loss of faith in their defensive positions, was as decisive as any tactical defeat. When soldiers no longer trust their equipment to protect them, when they understand that staying in their assigned position means accepting unacceptable risk, defensive operations become impossible, regardless of how well constructed the fortifications might be. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.